It's 9 a.m. sharp. People are furiously linking YouTube videos in chat. It is definitely not right. It looks like Diana. They pulled a fast one on us. Boys. These are the Diana cards, apparently. So this is the Targon Nightfall package. Lunari Duskbringer. When I'm summoned, create a Dusk Petal Dust in hand. We have no idea what that is. Lunari Shadestalker. Nightfall grant me... Oh, that was like... They gave that 2 seconds. Nightfall grant me elusive. So, it's a 2-mana 2/3, basically the same as like a Golden Narwhal. But if you play it like second in the turn, you get elusive. That's pretty good. You know what? I mean, I will say anything that gives elusive will always have some real potential. It's like this one's permanent elusive. Golden Narwhal's a pretty good card. A lot of people think of Golden Narwhal as a meme card. And it was not really great when it was a 3-mana card. Now that it's a 2-mana card, it's a perfectly competitive card. And a lot of people kind of like haven't realized that yet. This is a pretty good card. Elusive's like, it's kind of impossible for elusive to not have some kind of position, some kind of like niche in the meta. Crescent Guardian, Nightfall, gets 2 attack in addition to its Overwhelm 3/3. Woo! So, I think of this one like Iron Ballista. You look at Noxus, they've got a 3-mana 4/3 Overwhelm. This is basically like the same thing in terms of average value, but it's 1 point better when you Nightfall it, and it's 1 point worse when you don't, right? It's kind of like how you think about Crescent Guardian. This one's interesting. It's going to be a little hard to evaluate. It has potential, for sure, for kind of like the same reason as Iron Ballista. Dusk Petal Dust, this is the token that gets put in the deck. It doesn't have a gem, so presumably this isn't main deckable. The next unit with Nightfall, you play this round, costs 1 less. So basically, it's just a wild card for a Nightfall enabler. It's basically just like a, you know, this is my Nightfall enabler for the turn, right? Because it pays for itself. Alright, so yeah, Lunari Duskbringer basically is a 1-mana 2/1 that gives you a free Nightfall trigger later. That's a pretty big deal. That's a sick card. Obviously, that will see play in Nightfall decks. Just being able to get that free Nightfall later. You can also do stuff like discard the Dusk Petal Dust that has like spell synergy. So, I mean, this is like an easy card for Nightfall. Now, it's going to be too hard to evaluate the entire package without seeing like how Diana really works yet. We've only seen Nocturne side of things and some of Diana's support cards we're seeing today. Obviously, Nightfall is meant to be like a pretty aggressive package overall. These ones are so much better than the Shadow Isles package. Yeah, I think that's true overall. It also seems very likely that there's going to be some things that generate Dusk Petal Dust in the future as well. So, just to give things like a sort of preliminary overview, we've got, you know, okay, so obviously the deck is meant to be like Diana Nocturne. It's really hard to say like how good the entire archetype will end up being. We need to see how Diana actually fits into it. But Nocturne was looking a little chunky, so I'm not really too sure about the odds. But Lunari Duskbringer is pretty solid. I think I'm happy to give this card a swoon. I have no idea how good the archetype will be in general, but initial impressions of this, yeah, it seems like a swoon level card. It's like a very solid card that empowers the, you know, Nightfall archetype. You know, this is kind of an auto-included Nightfall, and it'll bring the archetype up a bit. Lunari Shadestalker. This one's interesting. I think elusive is a really strong keyword in a lot of decks. I think this card is pretty great. The one thing is, like, I don't know if Targon will really properly be able to build an elusive deck. In a Nightfall deck, it feels like you're often going to be hitting, like... It feels like this card is often not going to be your win condition with how a Nightfall deck wants to play. They're often going to be winning off of probably their champ flips, or like early aggression. This card has a chance of being like the Overreach, which is nice, and Nightfall has like a couple of buffs, so this card will find a home pretty well. I'm pretty happy calling this a swoon as well. It's like a pretty solid card. Honestly, this is the kind of card that I could call a Lux if Targon had like more elusive like synergy. I feel like the biggest thing with this card is like as theoretically great as it is, it doesn't really have the ability to be ran in an elusive deck. Like, you can't just like run an all-in elusive deck with Targon as far as the tools we've seen, but it's a pretty good Nightfall finisher. Nightfall's pretty aggressive overall, so there will be a lot of times where your opponent's just in that like 2 health range and this can be your over the top. Crescent Guardian is going to be a bit harder to use. Like I said, this card's kind of on the level of Iron Ballista, which is a card that kind of like, you know, it's definitely not bad. This card will make a lot of sense with the Nightfall, but when you commit to this card with a 3 health stat line, it's a little more awkward. And for the most part, Nightfall's a really awkward concept, right? So here's the biggest problem with Nightfall. Nightfall's very confused as an archetype. I really have to say, this is like the most important thing to understand about Nightfall. You have to understand, and I mentioned this in my like Nightfall analysis video, with Nocturne analysis, where I was talking about like the Nocturne set cards at length on YouTube. That was like almost an hour video. And one of my main points is like just talking about how to evaluate Nightfall and how it's kind of like a little flawed, or sort of like at least it's a bit worse than it looks, just because it's kind of confused and it doesn't know what it's doing. In many ways, Nightfall is trying to be like Aggro, the way they're printing their cards, like the 1 mana 2/1 fearsome Stygian Owl. What's it called? Stygian Onlooker or something like that. That's a very, very aggro card. Crescent Guardian, here's another one. This is a very, very, very aggro card, right? Like the way their stat lines are printed. The problem is that Nocturne's not really an aggro finisher. Aggro is looking for a high reliability, low value, low board dependence finisher, and Nocturne is none of those things. Nocturne is high value, like high like board reliability. Like he needs you to have a board to be like a decent card really for a finisher. Usually with aggro you're gonna want like a board independence finisher, which Nocturne doesn't represent. And another problem is like the Nightfall keyword itself is also not really geared for aggro, right? Like when you look at these aggro cards, you know, you've got Stygian Owl, which is like 1 mana, sometimes deals 4 damage. Crescent Guardian, 3 mana, sometimes it's a 5/3, but like aggro kind of wants to like develop aggressively and on curve. And Crescent Guardian is going to have a real problem actually nightfalling for value, right? It's like when you, like this is, look at this, the pure aggro potential of this card. Like this card is just all in aggro, but the way Nightfall works is, you know, you're not gonna be able to get it every single turn, right? It's like combo. So you need to like slow play a bit. Nightfall kind of like reads more mid-range. Overall, Crescent Guardian, it's got potential, but it definitely looks more clunky than some of the others. I think I'll call this a... I mean, this one's kind of impossible to evaluate without knowing exactly how Nightfall plays, or how it builds, or how it interacts with Diana, or specifically like how valuable the Nightfall triggers actually are going to be on. I will say, for the most part, Crescent Guardian is probably closer to a This Is Fine Yasuo in my book, but when we see Diana, I might have to upgrade it. It does look a little underwhelming compared to the others. And then Dusk Petal Dust isn't a card itself, and of course is just attached to this other card. Wait, did they only show 3 cards today? Oh, wait, they only showed 3 cards today. What? This is weird. Petal's not main deckable. Yeah, you can't main deck Petal. Turn 2 Petal plus Guardian. Turn 2 Petal plus Crescent Guardian. Wait, how do you do that? You can't play Crescent Guardian on turn 2, guys. Because Dusk Petal isn't main deckable. You will only be able to play Dusk Petal off of the Lunari Duskbringer. Honestly, the sad thing is, even if Dusk Petal was main deckable, you wouldn't main deck this, guys. I like... Honestly, if you guys are saying Iron Chat, like... If you guys are gonna flame someone for not seeing a gem, you are missing out on a real opportunity, because you should not be putting this card in your deck, even if you could, guys. Like, anyway, yeah, Dusk Petal Dust you can't really put in your deck. Overall, yeah, I don't see like and that I think is the most important thing to understand about Crescent Guardian, which is like the problem with Nightfall as a whole. I would say my initial perspective, and we haven't seen Diana yet, but my initial perspective is a lot of people are going to see Nightfall as like an aggro deck, and I think it's much more mid-rangey, and I think your best bet probably is to not get baited by like some of the like pure aggro cards in it. I think that you should play, obviously, aggressive, and you should play for some over the top, but usually your win condition is likely going to be off of, like, your champion level up, and you're gonna have the opportunity for some aggro draws. Would be kind of like my initial impression. This is kind of like predicting Diana's level up will be, like, somewhat valuable and lessened, like, the pure aggressive direction. So that's kind of how I would see Nightfall overall, right? Everything is mid-range. Not necessarily. So what I would say, like, how I defined it in my video, and I'll kind of make this, like, final point, just because, like, today they only revealed, like, 3 cards, so I feel like I have a bit more time to talk about this. So I'll kind of, like, summarize the point I was making in that analysis video, which is that, in my opinion, the fundamental difference between aggro and mid-range is that aggro transitions into a board independent finisher and mid-range does not. So basically the idea is aggro is a archetype predicated on dealing a lot of initial early damage to the point where they have the ability to devalue opponent mid-range units, specifically blockers, by transitioning into a board independent finisher, which is to say a finisher that allows you to end the game when you start your turn on an empty board. So I would classify something like Harrowing to be a board independent finisher by that definition, which is a little weird because Harrowing obviously gives you a board. The idea is, like, if you don't have a board, you can press a button and win the game. So, for example, I always call Lunari's Shadestalker a board-independent finisher, right? The idea of this card is, like, you can be very aggressive, you can get your opponent down to, like, 2 or 3 health, and then, like, even if your units are traded down, or even if the opponent develops blockers, you have the ability to, like, play an elusive and attack with it, right? Although when it comes to an elusive, it's kind of like a blurry line because you're not giving opponent blocker value, but you're still giving value to certain removal effects. And this is, like, I would say for the most part, the main difference in this distinction, and, like, the biggest fundamental difference between, like, aggro and mid-range is this idea of the amount of value you get when you transition away from a board-dependent finisher, right? Like, the whole point of aggro is your opponent will be at low health already when you're looking for a finisher, so you have the luxury to be able to switch to a board-independent finisher, because board-independent finishers don't do a lot of damage. That would be stuff like Decimate, right? So aggro is like, I'm going to do a lot of damage, and then my finisher is going to be something that's high consistency, low damage. That's aggro in a nutshell. And that's why aggro runs Decimate and not Decisive Maneuver. This is, like, the fundamental difference. This is why Decisive Maneuver looks like a good card and totally isn't, because it relies on having the board. Decisive Maneuver is like a mid-range card. Decisive Maneuver is high value, low consistency, which is the only reason to go for something like Decisive Maneuver. The only reason to try to get, because Decisive Maneuver will sometimes get more damage than Decimate, and the only reason to go for Decisive Maneuver would be if you hadn't dealt a lot of damage already in the game, right? Which aggro already will have done, so there's no point in going for Decisive Maneuver, right? So this is the distinction, and this is kind of like the problem with, like, Nightfall as a whole, in summary, which is this idea, it's this idea of, when you look at Nightfall, the way they're trying to finish games, I think is usually going to be built off the board, at least to a notable degree. Usually it's going to be, like, off of your champion flip, right? Like, Nocturne is trying to, like, you know, flip and win the game off of, like, some kind of, like, fearsome attack. And I think overall, I would say that that is a more reliable strategy than the aggro. So in my expectation, we'll have to see, and I might change my mind if I see Diana and it really surprises me. But in my expectation, it will be an archetype that will want to play for a board or champ flip dependent finisher, which means that this idea of early committal chip damage or early committal face damage, like, for example, that we see in Crescent Guardian, or like, for example, we see in the Stygian Owl. What is that card called exactly? I forget the name. Stygian Onlooker. Yeah, that was right. These two cards are really aggro, and I think that they might be a little too aggro for the archetype. That's my prediction. We'll see. You might categorize the elusive card in the same way. The Lunari, what's her face? This one. But I think that she's high enough value compared to the others to kind of, like, escape that categorization. Anyway, that's kind of like, either way, whether or not we think that Nightfall is going to fall into the aggro categorization or whether Nightfall is going to fall into the mid-range categorization, and that is very debatable. I think the most important thing, and I'm pretty sure like this is kind of like everyone agrees on, the most important thing is like part of why Nightfall is a bit awkward is because it's sort of like trying to do both in awkward ways. There's some Nightfall cards that are like entirely predicated on getting early chip damage, and some Nightfall cards that are like wanting to play a lot slower, and you don't really get as much value out of like splitting your game plan in exactly that way. Alright, but yeah, that's my overall initial impressions.